Things to avoid when talking about the Israel-Gaza conflict. Jon Stewart once did a skit on his Daily Show broadcast many years ago, where anytime he mentioned Israel or Palestinian, it resulted in a cluster of loud voices around him, shouting him down. Often, for those of us who maybe take a more nuanced view of things, it can feel a little bit like that when in conversation, especially when those conversations are urgent. There's no getting around it, however. We should and need to talk about this issue. Everyone does. This is an internationalized conflict now. There are stakeholders everywhere, from nation-states like Iran and the US, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, to individuals, relatives and friends of people trapped in Gaza or people who have perished. These very human and harrowing stories have emerged into our public consciousness. I'm reminded of Carl Sagan's dialogue line from the novel Contact. In it, the character says, "You're an interesting species. You're capable of such beautiful dreams and such horrible nightmares." And this week has been another of our nightmares. There are protests supporting Israel and others implacably opposed. There seems to be little nuance and a lot of emotion. That is normally the way in what Edward Azar calls protracted social conflicts. There is tribalism, flag waving, and any deviation from approved narratives is seen as betrayal or an indication that you're not on our side. People are pigeonholed on the basis of their remarks. And these tactics succeed because there are vested interests in ensuring that they do. Conflict is sustained by polarization. Humanize people, narrow the gap between the poles, and the conflict becomes that little bit more amenable to resolution. Conflicts are sustained by flawed and simplistic thinking. Let's think about some examples of bad thinking and unreflective assumptions, which will have to be jettisoned before this conflict, this wider issue, can move past this week. First, genuine peace seekers are going to have to reject, call out, and face down the conflation with Hamas and Palestinians. They are not the same. That seems obvious. It might even seem superfluous saying it, but we're a long way from making that distinction clear on all sides. The Palestinians are a stateless group of people with very legitimate grievances. Hamas are a theopolitical movement dedicated to ultimate goals that do not align with the wider real-world interests of the Palestinian people. They are also a willing instrument of Iranian foreign policy, a policy with equally sinister objectives. Hamas are not interested in peace or coexistence. Their founding charter, still not disavowed, says as much. Their mission is much darker and not open to compromise. The Palestinians will, one hopes, one day finally get a chance to reflect on their choice of government in Gaza. But now that perhaps will not happen for a long time. But in that time, and perhaps hoping against history, Palestinians and the people who purport to care about their fate must reckon with this paradox of Hamas. In short, those with the interests of the Palestinians at heart must part company with Hamas, definitively. We will have to wait and see if the gruesome and diabolical actions of Hamas's fighters in various Israeli kibbutz and towns, the beheadings, the burnings, the mutilations, the hostage-taking, will that finally bring the leftists, the Palestinian advocates, and the Palestinians themselves to their senses? They have to see that Hamas represents nothing. They are underdog imperialists. They are not resistance. They are tyrannical and brutal. The future that they work towards is not one that ordinary Palestinians will benefit from. Hamas's future is a theocratic future, an austere, anti-human future. And as they've already demonstrated, it's an undemocratic one. Pro-Palestinian supporters, especially in the West, have to stop chanting the nonsense line, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." No, it won't. It never will, not in that geographic sense. The clock is not going to go back to 1948. To pretend and wish that it might or will is to do a terrible disservice to the people of the Middle East, regardless of faith or creed, but especially the Palestinians. And the continued indulgence of this fanciful line smacks of a reverse imperialism. Implicit in this line is the eradication of an established nation-state. This is precisely the kind of utopian, ideological thinking that undermines the possibility of compromise. However we might disagree with the choices and decisions of historical figures, Israel is a fact. It has remained a fact throughout multiple Arab-Israeli wars, countless terror attacks, suicide bombings, and rocket attacks. Despite the murder of 1,200 Israelis this week, it will endure. To say that is not to flag wave on behalf of Israel, it is to recognize a reality. And 300,000 plus troops backed up by advanced weapons systems and overwhelming air power are going to ensure that Israel remains a fact well beyond the lifespans of these naive protesters or the Machiavellian desires of Iran and their Hezbollah and Hamas proxies. The sensible solution here is the embrace of the two-state solution. Yes, it's boring. It's well-trodden. It's probably flawed. It might seem impossible. But it is the only game in town. We have in the last few decades gone too far down the road of identity and communal politics for any other solution to be viable. Politics around the world has become balkanized. A civic constitutional settlement is beyond reach, probably for good. The only alternative to the two-state concept is more of the status quo, more of the same. A heavily militarized and securitized Israeli state and an oppressed, dominated and resentful Palestinian population. More death and destruction, disproportionately affecting the Palestinians, not the Israelis. The hard left's near fanatical flag-waving on this betrays a deeply flawed worldview, both naive and cruel at the same time. Naive because, like all utopianists, they are not connected to real-world human experience as much as they should be. Cruel because they are not the primary victims of this conflict or the conceptual framework around it, sitting comfortably as they tend to do in safe Western societies. For the anti-Israeli camp, they will happily sacrifice compromise and the welfare of Palestinians on the altar of ideological purity. After this week, one thing is absolutely certain. Israel will learn from this. Even if Gaza is rebuilt and Hamas vanquished, Israel will not take their security for granted ever again. This will be a sharp and cruel learning curve for them, but they will learn. There will be a reckoning within Israel itself, most likely with Netanyahu its primary casualty. But genuine security, genuine stability for the region can only come about when more realism is admitted into the conversation. Both sides, Palestinian and Israeli, are guilty of undermining this off-ramp of a two-state solution. They both need to put the ramp back in place. We have to accept that this solution will not, cannot, and should not involve Hamas. They won't want it. But equally, Israelis, their people, their government and their military leaders are going to have to rethink their strategy. It is the only real hope for a long-term secure Israel. Countless opportunities were missed and squandered. And yes, it is certainly true that the Israelis made concessions and had it thrown back in their faces with murder. But they must re-engage. Palestinians and the Arab world more generally have been poorly led and poorly governed. Their leaders have demonstrated that what irks them most is not the welfare of the Palestinians as much as the affront that Israel represents to Arab pride. If the last week has demonstrated anything, it is that the securitization of this conflict by the Israeli authorities, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in particular, has failed. It has also demonstrated that fanatical, ideological and fundamentalist thinking is once again dragging the hopes and dreams of Palestinians into the dust and craters of a shattered Gaza. Israelis pride themselves on their ingenuity, their creativity, their initiative. They are the start-up nation. Yes, they are. But so are all humans when the need arises. Without any hint of flattery, we can reflect on the ingenuity of Hamas in breaching Israeli defences using comparatively primitive technology to overcome a heavily militarized border and wreak havoc, destruction and death upon innocent civilians. All humans can be creative. It's a question of necessity, not race or genetics. If Israelis thought they had a monopoly on creative problem solving in the field of combat, then this last week has proven them wrong. Building the fences higher will not solve this in the long run. This is not primarily a security issue, it is a political one. It might seem impossible now, but if we project forward to a possible future where Israel enjoys peace and security with its neighbours, it will be because a majority of Israelis have come to see that peace through strength alone is not enough. There must be peace and respect for the other. Another cliché perhaps. But it's important to remember that this cuts both ways. The Arab world, Palestinians, their supporters, including those in the West, will have to accept Israel's right to exist. Iran's ambitions must be contained by the other larger Arab and Muslim majority nation states. Western progressives and well-meaning advocates for the Palestinian cause are going to have to temper their rhetoric and ambitions. What could unlock this is a combination of factors that are, ironically, outside the control of either Arabs, Palestinians, or their supporters, or the major powers. Wider Israeli society is going to have to face down their fundamentalist settler faction. The settler question in the West Bank is arguably the most intractable element of this conflict. This fanatical intransigence of the settler population, their self-righteous entitlement, the pandering to their base by the Israeli right wing, they have all prevented the resolution of this conflict. It is one thing for us to accept Israel's right to exist, but Israeli expansionism into the West Bank has done horrendous damage to mutual trust. Israelis know that this policy is bad. That's why the settlers in Gaza were removed. Less well reported is settler violence against increasingly squeezed West Bank Palestinians, and this is having a negative effect on the prospects for peace. First, it is radicalizing the Palestinians, predictable of course. Second, it is undermining the Palestinian Authority. Fatah looks weak because it is. It is powerless to stop this. Third, it is poisoning Israeli politics, with the inclusion of settler intransigence and reactionary fundamentalist right-wing elements in government. Again, we find a conflation that we need to challenge. And it's one we observers need to avoid. Settler interests are not the same as Israeli interests. The continued unquestioned satisfaction of settler demands is not in Israel's long-term interests. For this to be resolved, dramatic changes in attitude on all sides, among all stakeholders and observers, will have to happen. Israel must be recognized. But the question of the settlements is going to have to be engaged with seriously and courageously. Hamas and Hezbollah must be marginalized as legitimate actors, particularly by leftist advocates for Palestinian rights. Neither Hamas nor Hezbollah care in the slightest about the Palestinians. They have their own objectives. The practice of using human shields is evidence enough of this. The conflation of Israel with Jews to offset criticism of Israel also needs to be faced down. But above all, the primary populations implicated in this conflict each now confront a choice, even if they don't know it. Palestinians must cut Hamas loose if they are to ever have a future. And the Israelis are going to have to rein in the fundamentalists of their society if they're to have their future. But something tells me that this, much like the idea of peace for William Butler Yeats, will come dropping slow, if at all. There is a relevant wisdom from this Irish poet in another line from another of his poems. Too long a sacrifice makes a stone of the heart. Maybe we can end on a more optimistic note. Perhaps a remark from one of the world's most famous Jews can help us find a North Star out of this. As Albert Einstein once wrote, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them."